have everybody we're gonna get tonight. So let's get going. So this is the Sherborn Advisory Committee meeting for March 6th, 2024, starting at 7:02 p.m. Before we get well, let's do the agenda. Let me do a screen share of the agenda. Give me 1 second. Should bring that up. Quick screen rearrange on my end. Okay, so planned for tonight, we'll do some liaison reports, some different bits to report. I'll also do a bit of a additional preview of the public hearing and how that'll go a week from Saturday. We'll approve minutes. And then for our current meeting items, we have an opportunity, an agenda item to do any further discussion that's warranted on operating budgets, any that we want to go back to and talk more about. I've got a couple things to flag there, and any capital requests that we want to talk about any further, I've got something to flag there as well. And then we'll work through the town meeting, the warrant articles that we haven't already discussed, in a sense, the non-monetary warrant articles. And we'll just go through those in the order on the agenda, starting with the opioid settlement receipts, retail license for sale of alcoholic beverages, proposed amendments to the longevity policy, amending section 4.9 of the Affordable Housing Bylaw and the Community Preservation Act. And then we will wrap up with just a review of proposal for stabilization funds, reserve funds, supplementals, free cash, and the sort of other monetary items that appear that will appear on the warrant. And that's the plan. Hopefully we'll all go smoothly. So given that, I'd welcome a motion to approve the agenda as read, or if anybody has any suggestions, edits, changes they'd like to make, let's slip those in before we get to a motion. Not hearing any, would welcome a motion. Second?
Second.
Excellent. All right, quick roll call on agenda. Nora?
Aye.
Mike W?
Aye.
Penn?
Aye.
Natalie?
Aye.
Kelly?
Aye.
Mike F?
Aye.
Wasim?
Aye.
And I'm aye as well. So agenda approved 8-0. Okay, so Paul, I think will join us in a bit, but as I mentioned, he's still en route. Anybody whose arm I could twist to do minutes? Paul was up on the rotation, but he's obviously not here yet to do that. If he gets going and settles in, he might be willing to pick it up. But anybody willing to start that?
Sure, I can do it.
Wasim, was that you?
Oh, yes, that's
yes.
me.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Wasim.
Yeah, thank you. Nobody's favorite task, but important that we do it and get them appropriately posted. Okay, so for liaison reports, let me start with just a little additional. Let me stop the screen share of the agenda. And let me start with just a little bit more background on the public hearing, how that'll go. This will be review for people who have veterans who've done this before, reminder for them, and maybe has some helpful background for everybody who's doing this for the first time. So as I mentioned last week, for each warrant article, the structure will be public comment. There'll be a period for that. Then some advisory discussion. As I mentioned, I'll be looking for each member of advisory to say a little bit about their thinking on each issue. So before we get to voting, everybody who's watching in town will have some idea of how people on advisory are thinking about these issues. Then we'll have a session for additional public comment, and then we'll get to an advisory voting session where member of advisory would make a motion, either typically for favorable action or no action. And then as advisory, we would vote and have that recorded as whatever the majority is as our recommendation to town meeting. When we come to the operating budget article, and also for the capital budget articles, it'll go just in a little bit more detail. And then when we come to the operating budget, I will actually read off numbers for each department's proposed operating budget, all the things we've been talking about, all the budgets we've been looking at. They're actually in that document that I probably somewhat annoyingly sent around just like about 45 minutes or an hour ago. In the page BUD budget, annual town meeting warrant, there's a list of every department's budget, and I will read off for each department the total proposed budget for that department. Same thing for schools and other items. And when we get to the end of that, if there is any item that members of advisory would like to call a hold on, can call a hold, and then we will pull that item out from the operating budget. We'll then get to a set of non-held items in the budget, and we'd have a public comment and discussion and in that usual way on that. And then we'd vote on the non-held items. And if there are any held items, then we'd come to the held items and go through the same process for each of the held items. So for new members on advisory, that would be the opportunity if there's a budget item that either you think warrants additional discussion in a public forum or on which you have concerns about what's been proposed, that would be the place in the process to do that so that there could be a separate discussion. I will start at the beginning with a bit of setup and budget background, and I will do a bit of highlighting of particular budget items where there are kind of outsized changes, just so that everybody listening will have a sense of, what are the drivers of the proposed budget and proposed increases. So there'll be, more docs that'll come around that'll have all of those final numbers, which I will read off and which will give us that discussion for the operating budget. We'll do something similar on the capital budget where we'll actually vote on each of the items in the capital budget and in the special purchases line, whether it's financed with free cash or debt. We'll vote on each one of those. So just, again, wanted to give everybody a heads up on how that goes, because that's the part that will be a little bit tedious and a lot of numbers and a lot of detail to work through and a lot of repetitive voting on items. All right, so before getting to a couple of substantive items, any questions, comments about the process? I just wanted to make sure everybody had a sense of what that was going to look like in a week and a half when we get there. Everybody good? All right, you've all heard this before. Okay. All right. So a couple of things that I think are just worth flagging so everybody is familiar with numbers. Let me get another document shared. This is one of the documents that I sent around recently. And I want to just draw your attention to what the document is and then highlight a few particular bits. Okay, readable? Spreadsheet readable? Okay. So everybody should have a copy of this as well. So this is a very nice accounting that Deb Seifring and Jeremy put together that just sort of shows how we got from the first proposed budget, the first proposed budget numbers back on December 31 of last year, and then the various changes that get us to the bottom line current proposed budget numbers, reflecting things like the schools coming back with a version 2.0 that was a much smaller increase in version 1.0. Most of the things on here we've talked about in some detail. There were a few that I wanted to just draw everybody's attention to. And one is in the insurance area, where I think many people know this, but our health insurance quote came in significantly below what had been initially forecast. Same thing for some other categories. So there was some very good news there, which of course helps. And then a couple other things that I think haven't been talked about is in the schools. Of course, as we all know, the region and the budget and the Pine Hill budget in their version 2.0 came in lower by a significant amount than what was they had initially proposed in their version 1.0 budget. But there are a couple, not large, but important pieces that go the other way, which is the town also pays an assessment to the Tri-County Vocational School, which depends on the number of students. Same thing for Norfolk Ag School. And because of some additional students choosing to go to those programs in those schools, there's a bit of additional expenditure kind of within the school budget for those items. So that's the 57,000 and change on Tri-County and the 29,000 and change on the Norfolk Aggie. So just wanted to kind of flag those as things that I think we hadn't really talked about as a group. Make sure everybody was aware of that to, sort of see the full roll up. Jeremy, do you want to jump in and add some color or fill in any other pieces here?
Yeah, just to add, thanks, Dan, just to add to the Norfolk the Tri-County number there for 3 students. That also includes an initial assessment, a capital assessment for their new building. They to help get some, liquidity and funds to start their project for construction. They did a short-term borrowing and had to assess the borrowing cost to the member communities. So that 57,826 also not only has tuition, but some capital costs for their new building.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for the extra info. And I think, Jeremy, right, our assessments for the new building would be in future years anticipated to be larger as they get going on the project. I don't recall the numbers, but there are going to be some larger numbers coming.
That's correct. Yeah, this was just an initial borrowing. It was I think it was maybe like a 10% of the overall cost of the project.
Okay, thanks. So anybody, of course, Deb's here, Jeremy's here. Questions about any of this? Again, I just wanted this all to be out there so that when you get to the public hearing, people aren't surprised and, unsure of where these numbers came from or what they represent. Yeah, Nora, go ahead,
Can you
please.
just do me a favor and just explain SB assessors, the 7440 50 18? If you could do that, that would be great. Thanks.
Oh, Deb and Jeremy can jump in here, but the way I think the structure of the table is, the budgets that came in on December 31. There were a whole set of adjustments that I think, as Jeremy and Deb and team reviewed budgets that got changed for assorted different reasons. Then, there's some things that advisory wanted to do. And then there are these other changes that we just talked about. So that's the broadly what those numbers represent. And Jeremy or Deb, any extra color you would want to add on that?
I think that's pretty much it. It's basically the initial budget submissions as they came in, compared to where we're sitting right now. And for the most part, for the budgets that you have reviewed, for instance, like the select board budget, that 74 reflects what you actually have discussed, but is different from what was originally submitted. And likewise for the others.
So I think some of that was probably Jeremy and Deb, working with budget makers and, having discussions about, hey, is there is that the right budget number? Should it be smaller? Should it be larger? Oh, really, that line belongs in a different department's budget. Let's make some adjustments. And a lot of those sorts of things. I don't recall this specifically, but probably some informal discussions with others about, what should things look like. And so I think they were those sorts of adjustments. It was long enough ago. I don't remember, I wasn't a party to all those conversations, and I don't remember the specifics. But I think that was the general thing that's about.
Yeah, all of that whole top section was actually discussed before you saw any of your numbers. But we tried to tie it in, so because the numbers you saw initially was that 34,872. And then before advisory started reviewing, we were tweaking things here and there and stuff like that. So that total 15,875 reduction was all before you reviewed any of the budgets. But we outlined it here just because we didn't want you to get confused that you started at a different number than what was initially presented.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. So Nora, just a second, just another way to put it would be, I think the first budget numbers we saw in January were this 34,872, 759. And then by the time we started reviewing individual budgets, there had already been some changes made, which
That's
is what's captured
Right.
here.
Deb just said 34,000. Did she mean 34? Like, could you repeat that number?
34 million, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, thanks, Nora. I should be able to read numbers in decimal places, but apparently not tonight. Yeah, 34 million and so on.
So what does 74 mean? I'm sorry, I'm just kind of a little, what
Well,
does 74 stand for?
when we went back and really like reviewed the select board budget with the select board members, we tweaked something. Maybe something wasn't quite right, or they weren't level funding something, or there wasn't a cost of living adjustment on the longevity number, or, I mean, just small little tweaks here and there. We were just fine tuning their budgets.
And it
And again-
literally means, Nora, that from the initial roll up to when the meeting at which we discussed the select board budget, that budget went up by $74.
So it's $74. I just,
Yeah, yeah.
I just,
Okay, all right, we're just
Thank
getting
you.
units right here.
Yeah,
okay, so that's $74, $40, 50, okay, all right,
yes,
okay,
sorry.
I just, thank you.
Yeah, no, good clarification to get that right. I really was bringing this up as a way of highlighting the yellow items so that everybody would know that that's going on in the background. And the full budget model document that I circulated, that spreadsheet, in the budget ATM warrant tab, it has every number, every department's budget, as currently with the ongoing discussions between us and budget makers, Jeremy and Deb, has all those numbers there.
Yeah, I get, two of the larger differences there. The town buildings was due to being able to do a full analysis of the energy use for electricity and natural gas. So we were able to fine tune that. And then the transfer station, we have a contract renewal that we were able to negotiate. So those were able to be adjusted prior to your review, but after we had submitted the original budget.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so unless anybody has more questions about that, that is it for me on liaison reports. Anybody else with anything to bring to the committee and share? Okay. Oh, Mike, go ahead.
It's not exactly a liaison report, but I was able to go to the library and view the space with Sean, and I just wanted to kind of echo the sentiment that had been shared before, that for anyone that hasn't viewed the space, it's definitely worthwhile. And especially with Sean, he is able to provide a lot of information about the backstory and history. So really endorse someone taking the time to do that.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Mike. Anybody else with anything to share with the group? Okay.
I guess I have a question, Mike. Looking at the space, did it influence you in any way? Like, I know you get more information by looking at it. You can tell how big it is, but would it at all influence any questions you were going to ask of the project or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps to bring home the idea that, you can really envision this space being used in the way that's being proposed. And like I said, I think having the conversation with Sean and getting some of that backstory is also helpful, just to kind of know how we ended up where we are. Because
Go finish your thought. Sorry, and then I wanted to jump in.
Oh, just to some degree, I feel like advisory came in late in the process, so I think it's just helpful to get that backstory as much as possible.
What I was going to say is just we have an agenda item in just a minute where if we want to have a conversation about you know, the museum and people bringing fresh information, we can do that and come back to that. Okay, so give me a second and let's come to minutes. So thanks to Mike Flanagan for putting these together. And I will do the quick scroll through. I'm hoping everyone had a chance to glance to read through these ahead of time, but please stop me with any corrections, edits, typos, any other concerns about what's here. All right. Any suggestions, edits, changes? And if not, I would welcome a motion to approve the minutes as shown on the screen.
So moved.
Second.
Excellent, thanks. All right, so roll call. Wasim,
Aye.
Mike Flanagan,
Aye.
Shelley,
Aye.
Natalie,
Aye.
Penn,
Aye.
Mike Winters,
Aye.
Nora,
Aye.
and I'm as well. So minutes approved 8-0. Okay, let me get that off the screen. Okay. So here's our chance. You know, the very general agenda item that's here of further discussion of department budgets and capital requests. We can, I think, do this in any order. So if there's more conversation about the museum, you know, I don't want to repeat the conversation that we had previously. But you know, Mike's comment about, hey, saw the space, you know, kind of affected how he was thinking about it. You know, if anybody has anything new they want to bring on that or any other capital request or operating budget items, this would be a great time to do it. I've got a few, but wanted to just check with everybody. Anything else on the museum? Anything new that anybody wanted to?
I'll just kind of, again, as I said before in our last meeting, I think that anybody who's voting on this should really see that museum space. And also, I think it's important to think where it was coming from the basement of the, or I should say the lower level of the town building. And personally, I think if I can offer my personal opinion is that, you know, perhaps it can be done in a couple of phases. It doesn't have to be the whole you know, they had, if you look at the previous submission, you know, sinks, offices and whatnot. But I think it did change my opinion on it and in a positive way to support it, but maybe in a two-phase process. The same thing, by the way, about the tennis courts, not to bounce onto that, but since we're talking
Fine.
capital.
It's a wide open agenda item. It's anything we still want to talk about.
Okay, so then I would suggest looking at the tennis courts and potential pickleball courts. It does make sense, in my opinion. That pickleball courts can't really be done ahead of time, you know, otherwise you're destroying, as we talked about last time with Sean. And it has been definitely over 20 plus years that anybody can recall that those tennis courts have been done. And it is, to me, when I drive by there, that is a, you know, central portion of town. It's part of our town center in a way. It's not off to the side or somewhere else, say, you know, far away from town. And it is in pretty bad shape, in my opinion. And I think you know, even the fencing and whatnot. So I think it would be really a nice thing to finish off for our town because it is not in good shape, just even looking at the whole general area there. So I think that'll be a big plus.
Thanks, Nora.
I agree, Nora.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Um,
I'd like to, on the tennis courts, my plan is to go over and walk them and assess the condition as I see it on the ground, since I've only seen the photos that were presented last time. So that's my thought. And I have seen the museum designated space, the proposed space. I haven't seen it with Sean, so I hope I can perhaps connect with him on that.
Sounds good. Yeah, I just second the comments that if for anybody who hasn't had a chance to do that, it makes it all, whether you're in favor or not, it just makes it all a lot more real to see exactly what it is that's under discussion. So Paul just joined. Paul, so Wasim started with minutes. Are you set up where you'd like to pick that up and get Wasim's notes, or is it better for you if Wasim just handles it because of your situation?
It's up to you, Wasim. If you want me to take over, I'm happy to do that. Totally up to you.
You
I
got
can
it,
take your
Paul.
spot in the future. That's great. We'll just swap them. Thank you very much.
Okay. And Wasim, maybe you could just send your notes over to Paul for the first bit. That would be great. Okay. Thanks. And hope, Paul, that the weather in Orlando is warmer and better than it is here. I think we're supposed to get somewhere between 1 and 3 inches of rain tonight. So kind of a slog, kind of a
I
slog.
can't complain. It's pretty nice. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm late.
Very good.
Mhm.
Okay, so since we're talking capital, here's something I wanted to just float and gauge reactions to. I mean, we'll see when we vote at the public hearing, but I've gotten the sense that you know, there is a reasonable bit of support on the committee for the tennis court project. The other request was 100,000 for, I think, redoing, renovating baseball field 4 at Jameson. And some comments have come up in the last week that maybe that project could be postponed a year, that there isn't kind of a safety imperative, maybe a lower priority project than the tennis courts. So capital budget had voted to support that. But I just wanted to put that out there and get people's reactions to, you know, whether the sense is, yeah, that should be done this year, or whether, you know, people might think, yeah, maybe that could wait a year. And Dave Goldberg couldn't be here because I think the Rec Commission's having a meeting tonight. But in a conversation with him, I got the sense that they're very keen on doing that, but I think they feel like it's not as high a priority as the tennis courts, and that there aren't any safety issues, which at some point, if the field deteriorates to a certain extent, then there's safety issues if folks are playing on the field, but that it's not at that point. Nora, I think you're first. And again, I'm just interested in kind of getting a sense of the sense of the room and you know, what people might think about that one way or another.
So I think that's really interesting, Dan. I'm glad to hear that because, you know, as capital budget, I'm the advisory member of the 3-person capital budget committee. We voted first on that and we said no originally to the 675 initial proposal for the tennis courts and pickleball courts. And I have to say that if it was between one or the other, I would definitely go with the pickleball tennis courts over that. If I could, you know, go back to the future, to the past, whatever. I think that that is actually a pretty reasonable piece. I'd like to, is doing the tennis pickleball and then maybe putting off that baseball field.
Okay.
later.
Thanks, Nora. Penn, what are you thinking?
Pretty much the same thing. We've got, you know, a lot of expensive items on the docket, and whether we pass one, some, none, unless we pass none, we're putting some money in the capital side. So anything that we can slide off, I would be in favor of doing.
Anybody else with thoughts on that? Again, we'll get a chance to vote and, be official about it, but uh, somebody needs to mute. I hear probably a future advisory member in the background.
It's probably mine.
All right.
I was just I left it on just because I was
Okay.
raising my
Future,
hand.
I'll go with the future advisory member.
My only thought was I would be curious because I haven't gone over to look at the fields and the condition. Similar to the thoughts with the library and the tennis courts, it's probably worth viewing what the condition is, how
Yeah,
reasonable or how bad it is.
yeah. Yeah, I guess Dave's not here. I don't know if it will be obvious which of the four fields it is that's under discussion. Maybe I can get some guidance from Dave on that and send it around so that for anybody who wants to go have a look, it'll be clear which of the fields it is that's under discussion. Paul?
But I think just it would be good like in checking with David about whether he confirms that waiting a year will be okay with him. Like there was one baseball field that he said was the one that gets the most use.
Yeah.
So I
I
think if
believe
Dave
it's the field, it's the field closest to Pine Hill up the
Okay.
driveway,
So is
Oh,
that this one or a different one?
okay.
up the hill closest to Pine Hill.
Okay, right.
Closest to the school. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mike.
So if Dave is comfortable with waiting a year, then I would certainly prefer that, right?
Yeah. In my conversation with him, he said that it's a project that needs to be done, and the rec commission is intent on doing it, and they would like to get set up with kind of a call it a normalized or regularized schedule of maintenance, because every certain number of years you kind of need to take care of those things. But that I think the way you put it is tennis courts higher priority, and there wouldn't be any safety issues with waiting a year on the baseball field. I think would be
Right.
a fair summary.
Right. Waiting makes sense to me then. Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this one? Again, we'll all get a chance to talk more about this at the public hearing, but I thought it might be useful to provide some feedback to Dave and just again, okay, so I'm getting a general sense that people wouldn't be, and I have to check in with capital budget since they had supported this, and I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But okay, so I think this provides a sense of kind of the general sentiment of where folks are on that. Okay, good, thanks. The two other things that I wanted to just mention on operating budgets before we get to warrant articles is a couple where there had been some controversy and concerns expressed. And this is with both the Board of Health budget and the Rec Commission budget, and in particular, the proposal for part-time positions to be converted to benefited positions. Board of Health with admin having a boost in hours and that becoming a benefited position, and Rec Commission with the person who's currently filling both of the part-time positions to call that a full-time position and have that be a benefited position. And of course, the benefits don't appear in the operating budgets, they appear elsewhere in the town's budget. You will recall that I initially expressed concern about both of those. But after a lot of conversations in the last week and some additional thinking, I've come around to being inclined, at least for me. And again, somebody can call a hold on this, and we can officially vote on this if people want at the public hearing. I've come around to the view that those are both reasonable requests, and at least from my perspective, I would be inclined to support both of those. In the case, just for 30 seconds of my thinking on that, in the case the Board of Health, with the health administrator retiring, whoever fills that position is likely to need additional admin support. Whether it is done in the current structure or there's some restructuring in how responsibilities that are divided, likely to need some additional admin support, and very important to maintain continuity in that office so that with the health administrator going, there's a person there with a significant number of hours who has the institutional memory and the background to kind of keep things on track so that the Department of Health doesn't end up with kind of no employees that have any background or experience. And on the rec commission, with the person there who's doing the 2 part-time jobs, when you add up the hours, it's well into the range of what the town considers to be a benefited position. And for me, that one, it's just kind of a matter of fairness of if somebody's doing that work, that it to me seems like, as a matter of fairness, rather than saying, well, because your job is allocated as 2 part-time positions and another town employee is working the same number of hours, but it's considered a single position. It just as a matter of fairness and equity seems to me that, that ought to be a benefited position. So it again, depending on decisions people make about benefits, that certainly could, create some additional benefits costs. But that was where I came down. That's a change for me. That's different than what I had said in earlier meetings. So I just, maybe using chair's prerogative here, wanted to put that out and give anybody a chance to, tell me that they think I'm an idiot or whatever. I had a boss once that used to, at the Federal Reserve, can't do this anymore, but this was long enough ago that you still do this, would run up and down the hall saying, Sickle, you're an idiot. I'd do something you didn't like. So I'm accustomed to hearing that if anybody wants to throw that at me. So Natalie, you want to start?
Now, how many hours? You said that a part-time person had 2 part-time jobs. How many, what you said was well into benefited, how many hours is that?
I think for the rec, it adds up for the 2 parts. I think it adds up to 25 hours is what's in there.
And I was thinking, I think we're going to review the whole personnel plan at the city hall. So I don't know next year. So I don't know that we have to jump into anything and give people 2 more hours, right? For the health department, you said that's all you said significant hours, but they only want 2, right? 2 or 3 more hours a week, right? That's not really significant. And I think we can offload the permit pulling and all that with some of the seniors. So until we get a whole plan done next year, I think we could hold off on giving someone 3 hours that cost, unless, they want to take the benefit costs out of different parts of their budget, but I don't think that we have to jump into that, right? They're going to have a problem, right? Probably. But I don't think that
Oh, you're breaking up a little
throwing
bit.
money at a part-time person is solving their problem for 2 hours. So I think we can help them out with some clerical help from the seniors, then figure out who's filling the other role, how the job should be divided. And there's so many questions there that I don't think we have to obligate the town never-ending costs for a 2-hour job because we didn't bother to just wait a minute. We pushed the baseball fields off for a year, right? Or we're trying to just push it off for a minute and let us think about it. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
On both of those jobs.
Yeah. Thanks, Natalie. Nora, you want to go ahead?
Kind of segueing, first of all, I would never call you an idiot, Dan. I just want to, I mean, if it makes you feel better, I will, but offline, okay?
No, it's
But
okay. That's okay.
no,
That's okay.
okay. So, what were so for example, on the rec, what were the 2 job positions? So if there's 2 part-time job positions, what are the titles? And forgive me, but if you just happen to know off the top of your head, so if there's, should they be looking for somebody else for the part-time position instead of having 2 part-time positions combined as 1? And I mean, it's really, to me, the only place where we can save money for our town is, well, not the only place, but a significant place is these, part-time, full-time and whatnot. So is there a reason why one person has to have the same 2 part-time positions? And maybe Jeremy can answer since his hand is up on that one.
Yeah, Jeremy, go ahead. And I'm going to look for the names of the positions. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sure. Yeah. The 2 part-time positions for the rec commission, the rec department, which have been paid out of the revolving fund. There was a program coordinator, and then there was a person doing the maintenance aspect. So it makes them a lot more. So we've had issues with maintaining staffing in each of those roles because of the type of work that it is and a limited number of hours. So combining those roles, it's hoped that we're going to have a lot more stability, and also, those two roles are similar in that it's generally in other communities. There's one person that's doing that in a town like ours, not two part-time positions, because the program folks know what the field's uses are, and they learn how to maintain them, and oversees sort of the vendors doing the work to maintain. So there's actually would be an overall reduction in the labor cost, though, because of the two part-time positions becoming one. However, it does trigger the possibility of a benefit eligible position. It doesn't necessarily mean anybody's going to take the benefits, but it
Well,
would become eligible. And in the case of, and I just learned this relatively recently, but in the case of when you have a staff position paid out of a revolving fund, Mass General Law requires that all fringe benefits also be paid out of the revolving fund. So the Park Commission is prepared, should the person take benefits, is prepared to fund those benefits out of the revolving fund and not the town operating budget.
And I didn't, just let me slip in one quick thing. Sorry, Nora. I didn't make as clear as I should have. Jeremy touched on this, that I think the proposal is for that person's both salary and benefits, if as needed, to be paid for out of the revolving fund rather than from the operating budget. I should have made that clear at the outset. Nora, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted.
so I was just saying, I mean, with the advancements of different things, when you say programming and whatnot, is it, full-time? Is it part-time, the same amount of hours every week, even through the winter time when there are less things going on in the winter time? Or does that include basketball? I can talk maybe offline and don't want to take the time here, but I just feel like
It sounds like it does vary depending on the season. In this off season, I think, the person that's been filling in that role has had a fair amount of work to do, supporting their capital projects and coming to your meetings and other meetings, which may not be the norm in some other winters, but there's certainly a seasonal variation, but they do feel on average that that person would be working, 25 hours or so a week on average throughout the year. And with that continuity, they're hoping that they'll be able to build up the program, menu of programs that they offer, and increase their revenues into their revolving fund to help, provide more activities for folks in town, and also to help fund their activities.
more revenue for the tennis courts, for example.
Sure.
Natalie, you'd had your hand up before. Did you want to come back on something?
Yeah, I would just, so these two jobs together are now going to add up to like 23 hours, right? And so if they pull the money out of the revolving fund to pay for the benefits, are they just going to ask us much, for more next year? But if we could, I don't know if you need to do that for 22 hours. Maybe somebody could help them for 2 hours and they could keep it under to 20. It's still nowhere near what any person considers, kind of a full-time job.
Yeah, this is on, you're here referring to the Board of Health position.
Both, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think the issue with the Board of Health position is wanting to ensure continuity and sufficient admin support in a period where, the office is going to be short-staffed.
How many hours do they want to do that, Dan? They want to add?
I think Jeremy can correct me if I don't have this right, but I believe on the Board of Health, the proposal is for 22 hours.
24 hours
Going up
currently.
to like
24, Jeremy?
24 hours per week for the Board of Health position.
Okay,
The
thanks.
Board of Health has also looked at their budget, and I have been able to reduce their expenses to help offset that cost. So the nursing contracts, the public nursing contracts line that was previously budgeted or proposed to be budgeted at $8,280, they're reducing down to $1,500 because of the regional health district that we're a member of is going to be providing through grants and through that program the public health nurse. So they were able to sharpen their pencils a little bit to help offset their request.
But doesn't that regional health district, won't that do all the, it would do the whole job, really. We wouldn't even have to have a board of health person, but maybe we might have to have the
Unfortunately, we're not able to support that
clerical
that
person, but
regional
could we
district we
outsource the
can't
whole entire thing?
supplant.
Yeah.
The grant does not allow us to basically reduce the resources we put towards public health. It's supposed to find synergies where we can expand public health tasks. So that regional effort is not going to replace our current level of spending in the Board of Health, but it will certainly help mitigate some things going forward, like this public health nurse,
So it's
which
a
is
grant
actually
to
going to
have,
be an additional
so
service in that's going to be, we'll actually have a nurse, a half-time of that nurse that will be dedicated to the town of Sherborn, which currently we hire out at a fairly high cost for some, just a limited amount of effort. And we have to contract it out to some vendors.
so you have, so that grant, though, you mentioned a grant, how long is that gonna go on for?
It's a recurring grant through the Commonwealth.
Oh, okay. So, but you think to make this continuity in the the clerical part of the Board of Health office, to make the continuity and to keep the institutional knowledge, it's taking like 3 hours a week, right, Dan?
I think it's more a matter
That's
of,
what you're saying to me.
In probably in the long term, in the short term, during the transition, it's likely going to be more.
Yeah, so we're signing up for this for the rest of our lives, right? And our children's lives for 3 hours for 1 year when we're going to hire somebody. Is that what you're, is that, do I have this right or am I missing the boat here?
so I think there are two things. One, if it's 24 hours, I think the difference is 5 hours, not 2 hours. So
Okay.
5 hours a week rather than 2. And I think the continuity argument is not so much that the continuity, I mean, I think in this transition, whoever is filling that role either on an interim basis or a new person who comes into the role likely will need that additional admin support. I think part of the continuity too is wanting to ensure that the person who's in that role remains in that role, rather than having that person depart and then having a real kind of vacuum and lack of institutional knowledge in the health department.
We can outsource that role to some kind of a health district, can't we, Jeremy?
The admin, no.
Not the
There still
admin,
needs to be a
the
front
other
desk.
role,
There needs to be, what's that?
the other role, the one that is vacant.
No, we couldn't do that. That's not part of the outsourcing. There's there's various other the regional health district currently it's in its infancy stages, so there's a limited amount of programs offered. I mean, hopefully it's going to build over time as the communities work together more. I mean, we don't even actually have a formal intermunicipal agreement in place yet. We have a memorandum of understanding, so it's very early, but it's hoped that it's going to help us add more public health support and mitigate the need to to have that at the fund that at a local level, and find ways that we can share services as well. But there'll still need to be a local board of health that's sort of the front facing part of it, and like currently there in the regional board of health there's no sanitarians that would do septic or well inspections. That's not part of the services they're offering now, and that's a big part of what our Board of Health does currently. There's no food inspection yet.
But the person that we're planning to hire for that position does none of those either, right? Or our last one didn't. Is that
Yes.
correct, right? So
Yes.
okay, so
But
we're not.
they were providing the support that I think made it possible for the folks who were doing those inspections to do their work.
Didn't Lincoln outsource their Board of Health person?
I think Lincoln actually they happen to have, an agreement with the town of Lincoln for much of their Board of Health duties, but they do have staff that help support that. But that, I think that's a model they've had set up for years. So
So let me
It
jump
looks,
on to,
it looks like Plainville, from as what I can tell, outsourced almost the whole thing to Worcester Health District.
although
So
they
there
must
are
be,
health districts around that do the work, apparently, because
yeah.
and do you know,
it says
Natalie?
on Plainville's Board of Health
Yeah.
website.
Do you know, Natalie,
Pardon?
how much they're paying for that? Because I'm sure it's not coming for free.
Yeah, but we're hiring someone. Yeah, no, I don't. I could call them,
Yeah,
but we're
okay.
hiring somebody that might not even have experience, and we still have to, all the inspections we still have to pay for separately. And
Yeah.
now we're upping the clerical job and paying for them for the rest of our lives. So
Yeah.
somehow
Well,
someone's
Okay.
I
gonna,
think that's the unknown, Natalie, is what we're gonna, the position is, only recently been advertised, and we've received some decent resumes already. So I think it's an unknown what we'll find in the market, but I'm optimistic. And
So I wanted to give some other folks a chance to jump in here, and then we can circle around again if we need to. Deb, you had your hand up for a while if you wanted to.
Yeah, I just wanted to make note. I mean, obviously adding a benefit eligible person is really important, but in the meantime, we've also reduced a number of benefit eligible positions. Like in our accounting office, I used to be benefit eligible, as was our finance director at the time. Once she left and I assumed the finance director position, I didn't refill that position. So we reduced that by one. By combining the treasurer and collector, we've reduced a benefit eligible position. So we're not continuing to increase. Some of these increases are all offset by people leaving and things like that. So it doesn't continuously go up. It has stayed, our head count has pretty much stayed flat for the last several years.
Okay, thanks, Deb. So Nora, go ahead, and then Nora.
About that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to monopolize this. What about going just like temporarily overtime? What about overtime hours for now? Rather than increasing the hours, why not just do allow for overtime hours? Jeremy, what do you think about that? Is that possible? Is that something to think about?
well, you need folks to be able to give the overtime hours too, and that's the rub.
I mean, I think the continuity issue is whether, the people who are, the person who's there, wanting to make sure that they stay and don't leave. Okay, so I'm going to go to Shelley, and then I don't want to. Obviously, there are strongly held views on this. I don't want to just have an endless back and forth argument. So if people have new things to add, that's great. Ultimately, this will get sorted out at public hearing and all. So Shelley, go ahead.
I guess my thought is if we want to incentivize the person to stay, is there any thought about increasing in some way their hourly pay now to incentivize them to stay without adding additional hours?
I mean, that's.
I mean, I
yeah.
understand that would increase the budget a little bit. I understand, but I mean, if there's a possibility that if we lost this person, we'd have to potentially pay more to somebody to be competitive to get a replacement for them, wouldn't it be more like cost effective to just reward them for the work that they're doing now and show them how appreciated they are and hopefully keep them in the position?
I think the question is whether or not that would keep them in the position, and I think that's not, that's that I think we don't know whether that would be sufficient incentive. Okay, so a range of views here. Was there anybody else who wanted to jump in on this? And again, looking for new comments rather than just kind of, we could go back and forth on this for a long time, but we have plenty of other things to talk about tonight. And I would be happy to have, offline conversations with folks to kind of dig into this more if that would be helpful. Okay. So any other capital items or operating budget items that people wanted to revisit before we get to talking about warrant articles?
Yeah, Dan, may I just say that I'm not going to vote against this item, but I will urge everyone to, we keep on talking about giving someone, overtime when they're working extra hours. And rather than that, I would rather think about, hey, how can we save somewhere else? And right now we have, I think, more than 100,000 in the rec budget for, field maintenance, essentially fertilizer and pesticides and things like that. I'd much rather, let's say, cut 15,000 out of that than deny someone a full-time position if they're doing the work. I mean, there's someone who's doing the work deserve, to be compensated for it, right? So I'll probably look for savings elsewhere in the budget, and I think those do exist.
Okay. Thanks, Wasim. Anybody else on this? Natalie, last word, and then we should try to move on. And
Oh, I have a question about the museum capital budget. Are we talking about that tonight?
we can.
I was when I was reading some of these documents, is there anyone that's speaking to that's on tonight? I was reading the documents, and we already got an architect who made a plan. So what's the 100,000 for that they want next?
So here's the way Sean explained it to me. I think the plan that was done, I think it was like, I may not have exactly the right number, but something along the lines of $13,000. And I would say that was a conceptual plan with here's kind of a vision for what this could be. And then the person who did that, who had some significant experience, in municipal construction, said, build a project like that would cost about this. So that is a conceptual plan, but not a document that could actually be put out to bid. Because if it's something that's going to be put out to bid, then you need the way Sean explained it to me is it's going to be a 200-page document with specs that exactly says what it is that the contractor's going to do, rather than, well, here's kind of a drawing of the space, some rough idea of what it might look like. But to put it out to bid, it has to be, here's the specific list of things that are to be done as part of the project. So I think the 100,000 is meant to provide funding for preparing the sort of plans that could be put out to bid. At least this is the way Sean explained it to me, as compared to just kind of conceptually, what might things look like.
Did this person make a drawing or anything? We haven't seen anything. Have we? I haven't.
So there is a report that they did that had the basic stuff. I probably have a copy somewhere and stashed in a.
I have a copy of it and also the outline, Natalie. It included an office.
Right. Just send it to me.
Because
Okay.
when it came to capital budget, I think that all those materials were presented, right, Nora? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Penn, go ahead. You are muted.
There you go. Thank you. So the two things are in the, I'm trying to think of, in the 12-3-23 first round of proposals. I'm trying to scroll up to it. Sorry to. On the Historical Society thing, it says a preliminary design has been drafted and a consultant used to perform a detailed estimate of the complete construction cost. That seems fairly far along, and it seems that given that, this is an awful lot of money to get from, I gather a model's been created to get from a fairly conceptual, a fairly good plan to, you know, a you know, I mean, if a the percentage of finished construction, you know, a house might be 8-10% of the final project. That's designing the whole thing. This is we have a design apparently. Now they're trying to figure out how much it's going to cost, but according to what was written there, what we have now actually provides a detailed estimate.
Yeah, I think though the detailed estimate, I think, you know, it's true that the person who worked on it, you know, said for a project of this scope, here's about how much it would cost. But that's not a document that you could put out and get bids. And I think there's also been a lot of discussion about trying to get whatever is done, trying to get it done in a way that would provide some range of options to the town for, you know, how basic or how fancy. But I think that what's been done thus far is not a document that could be used to solicit bids. It's just that's not what it was for. What it was for was, you know, sort of an initial idea of, you know, roughly speaking, if you want to do this kind of a project, how much might it cost? Which is, I think, very different than the sort of document that's needed to go out to bid.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So as I said, I don't want to. I'm guilty of this too. I don't want to just rehash the same arguments because we have a bunch of other stuff to talk about tonight. And as I said, I'd be, you know, on all, yeah. So unless somebody has something else new to bring in, let me suggest that we move on to talking about warrant articles. Okay, good, thanks. So let's start in on that. So the first two warrant articles would be that are the non-monetary ones. And I can maybe I should pop the warrant up on the screen. That might be helpful. Give me a second here. Okay, so one other thing I can just mention, when we get to the public hearing, if you look at the warrant, articles 1 through 6 typically are routine and not controversial. We'll talk about stabilization funds at the end. So I would anticipate that those would be done as a consent agenda where we would, at the public hearing, if there's agreement that it's reasonable to do those as a consent agenda, we would vote to take articles 1 through 6 as a consent agenda. Then we talk about the articles, then we would vote to approve them all at once and not have separate individual votes on them. But then we come to well, then there's the overall budget that we talked about, the capital improvement plan that we talked about. And then we come to the ones that we really haven't talked about yet, which would be the opioid settlement. And we're going to jump out of order and talk about then the retail license for sale of alcoholic beverages. And Jeremy, I think you were going to say a few words about those just to describe for everyone what those two articles would do.
Sorry, Dan, number 10.
Yeah, number 10 and number 13.
Yep. The article number 10 is for the opioid settlements. There's been a number of manufacturers that have settled class action suits that have provided funds to Massachusetts municipalities to help fight the opioid epidemic. The town has already received $17,271.77. That has necessarily, by Mass General Law and the municipal accounting standards, has had to kind of sit in free cash, and the town cannot expend that without an appropriation. So to do that, to make that appropriation, the best practice is to put these funds in a special revenue fund. I might not have the term correct, but in a special fund created for the purpose of holding these opioid settlement funds, such that they can then be used later. Otherwise, they just kind of sit in free cash. These funds can't be used for anything other than the purpose of the fund. So it's not like a general revenue. It's just for that purpose, but it just kind of sits there in free cash until they're put into a special fund. There'll be a few more years of receipt of these funds. I went through this morning and was actually surprised at the amount of funds that we'll be receiving over the course of this. And they all vary depending on the company and the settlement. There's one with Walmart, Teva, Allergan, CVS, Walgreens, and Johnson & Johnson. But the sum of those over the course of a few years will receive $61,200 in total funds for the opioid settlement. And if they're put into the special revenue fund or the special funds, then when the Board of Health develops a plan for their use, they're reaching out to Dover's Board of Health to see if there is some synergy there. They'll be working with the school department as well to come up with a plan for their expenditure. But this is kind of an accounting cleanup so that the funds can be used for their allotted purpose. Article 13, it would be to request special legislation to allow the town to convert a wine and beer alcohol license for not to be consumed on premises, but a retail license for a property. I believe it's 11 South Main Street. Art Specialties currently sells beer and wine. They're looking for a full license so they could sell other forms of alcohol. There's no issue from the police department as far as safety, and they support this. But to convert that requires the select board to be authorized to request special legislation to the State House.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So questions about those for Jeremy? Yeah, Penn.
Thanks, Dan. I just have a quick question, and I imagine there are a lot of details, so no need to go too broadly. But how much flexibility do you know is there in spending the opioid crisis money? In other words, could we give some of it to the police department for, working with the schools? Or, how directly to recovery and treatment does it need to go?
There are some, and that's a great question, Penn. And after, finding out, we don't have all of these funds in hand currently. This is over the course, some are 10 years in duration to receive all these funds. So it's not all coming at once, but, given this amount, we may need to be necessarily flexible in the expenditure. So it's a great question that I don't have the full answer to. And I think it may depend vary a little bit based on each of these settlement agreements, but I think there is some latitude, but it still needs to be linked, and there's a reporting requirement to the Commonwealth. Annually, we have to report to them on how we spend these funds, so there is some oversight as well.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. So then, thanks everybody. Thanks, Jeremy. So let's jump then to Article 15, which would be an amendment to the longevity policy adopted last year at town meeting. I think Nancy Hess was going to talk about that. And in that packet of docs I sent earlier, there was a document that was what policy was approved last year. And this is about changing or slightly amending that policy. So Nancy, the floor is yours.
Okay, I consider this amendment housekeeping and the simplest way to make the policy fair and inclusive, which was the original intent. I was on the personnel board last year when we developed the longevity policy in recognition of loyalty and dedication in service to the town, and as incentive to continue, because as we know, turnover has a cost. The only two benefited exclusions were to be for those positions that were able to negotiate longevity in an agreement, such as through a contract or union. In the process of preparing the presentation to town meeting, it became clear that any elected benefited position would require a separate explanation because any compensation for such a position requires separate disclosure, as we do in their budgets. We would have already voted the budget, and there was an article to eliminate one of the elected positions. So there was a fear that the complexity that already existed in the thorough explanation of the new policy would just be greatly exacerbated if we had to add another step or two, and the whole thing might fail. There was much discussion and debate with the select board as to possible workarounds, but there was no quick and easy resolution. So we went forward with the simplest version. I needed to leave the board early in December, but realized that time for warrant articles were closing, and there were several things we had not addressed. Now that we have only one elected benefited position left, and that's the town clerk, and this position meets every other requirement in the policy, I felt strongly that this inequity needed to be corrected without waiting another year, so initiated the citizens petition. I believe that in order to achieve the mandate in this amendment, we only need to go to section 22 of the Personnel Administration Plan, section 3, numeral 3, and I think that's what you have sent to everybody. Sentence 3, and remove the two words "and elected." All the other requirements are well spelled out, and that position will fit nicely in compliance. The only thing that differentiated elected benefit employees from those employees that were covered by the policy was the fact that they were elected. So I am hoping that you'll be able to support this amendment and we can get a fair and equitable policy in place.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So just to give the one sentence, just to mirror back the one sentence version, would have the longevity pay policy apply to the one elected, the one
Benefit.
elected paid official in town.
Not just paid, benefited.
Benefited, yes, thank you, okay.
Yes.
So questions, comments for Nancy, concerns about that? Not hearing any, okay. Thinking then sounds like probably not going to be particularly controversial since no one's raising any concerns. Okay,
That is my hope.
okay. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for joining us and thank you for walking us through that.
Well, thank you. I'm sure you're all exhausted.
There's always a lot to
appreciate
do. Always a lot to do. Thanks.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
So then moving on, we're going to come to the long one here, which is Article 14, which is amending section 4.9 affordable housing, and Addie Mae Weiss from the planning board is gonna walk us through that. Addie, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Let's see, can I share my screen?
Yes, let me just kill the screen share first. And you are good, should be able to share.
Let's see. So, it's been a while since I've used PowerPoint, sorry. So I don't know if it gets chopped off the way.
It looks good.
Okay.
Looks good.
So I just wanted to I think there is some discussion or there's rumor mill going on out there that we are suddenly knee-jerk doing this warrant article change as a reaction to activities with related to last fall's special town meeting with the water sewer district and the affordable housing developments proposed on Coolidge Street. And what I want to make sure it's clear is that that's not the case. That's one of many elements that is prompting this amendment proposal. The inclusionary zoning is something that the planning board worked on for a long time. 2016, we started doing research, and the town planner reached out to the Mass Planners Group and asked for ideas and how do other towns have their language set up. And then we were working on, the planning board was both working on MAPC, and there was a town center housing study that was being conducted on walkability and our town, and where do we see maybe denser housing, maybe adding affordable housing, and a lot of discussion was looking at the town center and inclusionary zoning and how would that fit. 2017, we published the housing production plan, somewhat prompted by the Fields of Sherborn 40B, kind of making more people in town aware of the 40B process and the kind of implications if our town does not wake up and think about seriously how do we add affordable housing to the town. So that process was a conversation that was deeply explored by many boards, many people, starting in 2016, 17. And in 2019, the planning board kind of dug out. There had been drafts of inclusionary zoning warrant article language, stopped and started for a couple years there, and they said, okay, this is the year. Let's finally really take this seriously. The master plan had been published, the housing production plan had been published, the open spaces plan had been published. So we tackled inclusionary zoning, and we did a lot of discussions with other towns. We had worked with MAPC, we worked with, and the big challenges at the time were a lot of towns use things such as density bonuses, which are incentives for a developer to utilize the inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning is targeted for a percentage of homes in a subdivision being affordable. So it's an alternative to a certain degree to 40B. And so there's where our challenges were, because how do we add affordable units? And so we were looking at it and thinking, well, we would do 15% requirement because that's less than 25%. But we were still asking everyone to go through the local zoning, and there's just a lot more incentives that make a 40B more financially feasible for a developer. And lessons learned, we were told that 15% would be high. We also struggled. We went with, as a town, we said, okay, 2 or more, because we had talked with other towns who said, well, they had, the tipping point was 10 homes, and then they found developers were building lots of 8 and 9 unit subdivisions. And we said, well, we don't want to create a loophole. We're just going to start the minute you have 2 or more homes, we will require either a payment in lieu or an affordable unit to be built. And that makes, again, we have learned over the years that there's challenges, but at the time we were desperate to try and figure out how are we going to add affordable units. Let's see if I can get to the next slide here. Sorry. So 2020, we came forward, and again, as I said, we were aiming for 15%. Someone did put forth a motion looking to go to 10% and not 15% at that time. And our argument was we were really in a place where we needed to be aggressive about adding affordable units. Looking at 2020, we didn't have a lot of housing production going on. So that was, it's always Sherborn historically until recently, there were homes that were knocked down and then a new home built in the same lot, but adding new units overall has been kind of at a rate of 1 a year. So since 2020, no developer has used or expressed an interest in using our inclusionary zoning to develop a subdivision. The only new developments have been 40B projects. And so given that, and given the number of 40B projects that continue to confront the town, we felt we really needed to look at, well, what, did we create a situation that maybe made it prohibitive to build, anything more than a single family house? And are we, are there reasons to encourage maybe small developments for the kind of character of the town? We don't have CPA funds. We don't have other items to incentivize what the current inclusionary zoning was. So we're proposing the following changes being proposed are to decrease the requirement from 15% to 10%, so that at least we are staying status quo. If the town is required to have 10% of its housing stock as affordable, then we feel we should at least maintain a requirement of 10% affordable, and increase that trip point of when an affordable unit is required in a development to when a development is 6 or more units rather than 2. So, you might have a developer who's got a 6-acre parcel of land and wants to build 2 houses. We don't want to burden him with an extra $200,000 cost on top of the construction to because of the way the calculation works for affordable housing, with it being currently at 2 units rather than 6. And we also are bringing it down to 10% because while we're not bringing forth the 3A MBTA communities multifamily zoning warrant article this year, as there's a number of changes and things that we still are working on, we do know we will eventually need to comply. We have until we will need to bring it forth next town meeting, because in order to be in compliance with the state and not risk losing out on, as we're all seeing, a number of grants, we will need to find a way to comply. And to comply, we need to be at 10%. We can't ask for 15%. So in order to be in compliance with MBTA zoning requirement, the requirement is no more than 10%. And kind of last is, well, what does this mean for the proposals on Coolidge Street, and especially Meadowbrook Commons, which the town, it's not a 40B, it is an EA zoned project. Meadowbrook Commons, as part of the EA process, came forward with a preliminary site plan. But there's still, as part of that process, and the reason why we preferred EA is because it will go forward for a full site plan review in front of the planning board, and all of the other regulatory boards will have the opportunity to weigh in at the time that they do finally, hopefully, come forward, if that proposal actually gets headway, depending on the infrastructure situation. And at that time, whatever the zoning is at that time will be the zoning rules that apply. So if the town this spring chooses to support these amendments to Section 4.9 of the Affordable Housing Zoning Bylaw, then it still goes to the Attorney General's office for review, like all of our zoning bylaw changes. And then once approved, the Attorney General, by the Attorney General, it becomes effective as the date of the town meeting vote. So, so that's kind of in a nutshell of what we're asking for.
All right, thanks, Eddie Mae. So the whole bylaw with the redlining, longish document, and it sounds like that one slide really highlighted the key points, which is for multi-unit development, the requirement would be 10% affordable rather than 15% affordable, and that there'd have to be 6 units before that requirement would kick in. And the rest of the changes you didn't really touch on, but are just cleaning up language and name of an agency change. So let's get the words in line with. So I mean, those are really is that right? Those are the substantive changes,
That's
and
correct.
the
That's
rest is just all cosmetic stuff.
the rest of it is cosmetic. I mean, when we had it at 6 units, there were a number of complicated calculations. I mean, when it was when it was at the tripping point was at 2 units or more, that then there was a whole series of complicated calculations and examples that were written in, partly because it gets complicated to come up with a percentage of one house essentially when you only have two homes being built. So there was a lot of kind of it was, you know, our proposal is really aimed at making this a lot more straightforward, a lot cleaner. The reality is there are not a lot of examples throughout the Commonwealth of inclusionary zoning having a lot of great success, regardless of where you are with your numbers. But it is still the kind of the tool in the toolbox for producing affordable housing that is recommended. And so we are pleased that we were able to pass it in 2020, but we would like to make it maybe more effective by bringing it more, you know, financially feasible to be utilized and not push towards a 40B project.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. All right. So, you know, out of our usual wheelhouse of financial stuff, since this is zoning, so this is a great time to, with Addie Mae here, to ask questions, make sure everybody understands, you know, everybody understands as much as they want to about, you know, what this does and the consequences, and, you know, Addie Mae's case for why this would be a good change. Yeah, Shelley, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Addie Mae. I think that's probably was factored into this, but with this reduction going from the 15% to the 10%, put us in line with other similar towns so that we'd be like better positioned for competing for some of the developments. Is that also one of the ideas?
I mean, I think so. I mean, to a certain degree. I mean, there's you know, we looked at the town of Westminster. There were a number of towns that, you know, Lincoln's, there were towns that we looked at that, like Sherborn, are well and septic, which that changes how expensive it is to do development versus, you know, where our region that we frequently gather with other town planners and develop economic development people is MAPC, where the SWAP Southwest Advisory Committee region. And so it somewhat is a challenge sometimes when we're kind of in forums, because most of them are on a sewer and public water supply scenario. So the cost modeling is not the same, you know, the impacts. However, yes, there were almost no towns that were tripping it at 2 units to require affordable home production or payment in lieu. So we were, like I said, in 2019, when we were really pulling this together on the heels of putting together the housing production plan, we were trying to be aggressive as possible to figure out how on earth we could add affordable units, and then ideally in a, you know, moderate pace and not a 40B pace. But so we hope that this will be a useful tool, and maybe more useful financially than it is in its current state.
Thanks. Paul, go ahead.
Right. So thanks, Addie Mae. So I was wondering if you know of any drawbacks or reasons not to make this change. Being the expert, it's hard for me to grok this, but curious if there's anything else we should consider or reasons not to support this.
I mean, I can't really think of a reason not to support this change. You know, there were a number of people who in 2020 were saying that the language of 15% and 2 units was potentially problematic for encouraging developers to not use inclusionary zoning and instead to just either do 40B or not build anything more than a single family house. So I guess the drawback is, I think it's like any bylaw, we try to write the best bylaw, and you do all the research you can, and then you have lessons learned, and thankfully we are able to go to town meeting and we tried something and we've learned something, and now it's time to let's adjust and let's clean this up and make this make more sense.
Thank you. That's helpful, Anime.
Thanks. Marion, did you want to add some color information here?
Yeah, this is just adding color. I mean, Adi May explained it very clearly. But one thing that we have heard is from people who are wary of the developments on Coolidge Street. One of those is a age-restricted development that originally in its plan that was approved at town meeting had 10% affordable, which was perfect. But then in the interim, this bylaw was changed 2 years later by the planning board, and I was involved in that, to 15% in our race to try to get affordable housing. So then that would make, if this were not passed, it would make the age-restricted development on Coolidge to have 15%, which makes it less feasible for the developer, but also is really not fair. It's a change in midstream. It's moving the goalposts. So we've been accused of changing it for the developer, and that's not at all what's happening. As Addie May says, there's a long history and a clear rationale for making this change back to 10%, regardless of the developer on Coolidge Street.
Okay, thanks, Marion. Mike Flanagan, you're next.
Thanks, Annie. And I apologize. I mean, the rationale, we moved it to 15 for, did you cover this? What reason exactly, initially during that process?
The 15 was what was written when we were writing the bylaw in 2019, I believe. I think what, the movement discussion relates to the EA zoned approval in 2017 that approved 10% affordable units in 2017. Then because our inclusionary zoning bylaw, which we at the time were not writing it to encompass the EA project that had already been supported and approved. And again, that's a lesson learned hindsight that, we found after the fact. Well, I guess it would change because a preliminary site plan approval is not the same as the full plan approval.
So anything that hasn't been has received a final approval from planning board would then be able to would have to meet this new bylaw. And anything that's already been approved for final planning, can they go back and get the 10%?
When they go forward with coming before planning board with their final plan, whatever the zoning is, when they're having their final plan,
At that time
will be the zoning that they will be required to adhere to. Got it.
And then just practically speaking, moving the minimum from 2 to 6, what is it's 10% of 2 or 10% of 6? Is that are we talking, obviously you can't have a half a house. Like what does that actually mean?
I mean, I think at one time I know that it was when we did a calculation, if someone was looking to build 2 houses, they would, on top of their construction cost and the land cost, would, based on the kind of the calculation that we do for looking at the 18 months worth of average housing sales throughout the town and taking that percentage of that it was gonna be about an additional $200,000 on top of the, that would be a $200,000 cost.
Addie Mae, that would be a payment in lieu in that,
Right, to the housing.
they can't build a fractional house. And so there's a formula for calculating what the value of the fractional house being market rather than affordable is. And they would then make that payment to the town.
And so the only point being is that for development of 2 houses, we have a number of developers in town that live in town and have built nice homes where they've built, 1 or 2 on 2 lots side by side, and that would be constituted that would be considered a subdivision, and it would trigger this payment in lieu requirement, which I don't know that we really have that intention of.
Gotcha. Okay. So and that payment in lieu requirement is staying within this new proposal.
Right, because it's a percentage that's in the bylaw, so that because of the idea that a developer could either build an affordable house or they could do a payment in lieu, and then there's a calculation.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Pen, go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Sort of following up on Mike's math. Was there any idea of just putting the minimum up to 10 houses so that somebody could actually build an affordable house? Because it strikes me as if you make the minimum lower than a whole unit of houses, if you would allow me to say it that way, then the payment in lieu simply becomes a developer's tax. And that certainly seems counterproductive to trying to incentivize anyone to develop. Whereas if somebody says, all right, I'll build 10 units, I'll make one of them affordable. It seems they're more likely to build that affordable unit than they are to say, I'm going to build 6 units, make one of them affordable, or instead I'll just make that 6th unit not affordable and pay what is in effect a tax. So I was wondering, is there any thought of going to 10 and give developers kind of a less mathematically challenging path?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a really good point. It's like the more you kind of play with the math and the numbers and try to figure out, well, what would be as a likely scenario and what is the sweet spot that encourages. But we did look at a number of towns, and we felt like if we were making a jump away from 2, that there were a number of towns that are using 6 as their in their language, and so we felt like 6 was a more moderate change rather than jumping to 10. It's hard to know the right spot. I mean, 10 makes a lot of sense, but I think at this point the language that we're putting forth and that's been approved is for 6. I don't know if Heidi has anything to add to that idea.
I just jump in with thank you for that. I guess my thinking is, if we're comparing to other towns, we should give some thought to whether other towns have had the slow rate of development that we have. We're actually not just on affordable housing, but just on housing. I think we need to be playing catch up. So I'm wondering if we should be a little more generous in the scope we give, rather than trying to just notch it up incrementally.
Thanks. Heidi, did you want to add something on this?
Sure. I think Addie made we're rounding up, that the fraction is if it's 0.5 or more, you're rounding up. So that's why 6 was chosen, because then you are rounding up to a full even 1. And that's why at 6 units, that triggers, it becomes 1 affordable unit. We did look at a bunch of other towns, and I think the steps was, again, trying to be moderate, not to go over too much, because we did hear from other towns that there were a lot of 8 and 9 unit developments to avoid hitting 10 and to go underneath the affordable. And with our small housing market, 8 or 9 homes will make an impact on trying to reach our 10% goal. You know, every time you add 8 or 9 houses, we now have to make up those units someplace else to make a 10%. It makes our bottom line number drive up. So, but I mean, I think that was the rationale, is that we rounded up from 0.5 and upward, rounded up.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. Mike?
I don't think I'm opposed to this measure, but I just wanted to throw an idea, and it might be a terrible idea, but I'll throw it out anyways. I'm generally kind of in favor of incentives as opposed to penalties. And I was just wondering if there had been any kind of attempts to find a way to incentivize a developer to build an affordable unit as opposed to punishing them for not doing it. So like, you know, instead of a payment in lieu of, you know, some sort of ability for them to either, you know, not have to pay for permits or something, you know, something like that. I don't even know if, you know, that's something that you can do, but I'm just throwing it out there just to see if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I just don't think we don't financially have a lot to offer for an incentives. I think towns that do have community preservation act could work with the developer and say, we would offer, you know, there's other ways, not necessarily through the inclusionary zoning bylaw, but there are ways to encourage production of affordable homes with other resources. The inclusionary zoning bylaw was also developed to create some funding for potentially, you know, if a developer chose not to actually build the affordable unit, because it might be cheaper for them to just do a payment in lieu, then the trust at least would start to build some funds and could utilize that towards either a Habitat for Humanity type project or some other project. But at the moment, we just don't have, I mean, our permitting fees are not, I don't think, you know, I don't think it would be that big of an incentive. And I don't know that we have a lot of other tools.
Wasim, go ahead.
So, Addie, you mentioned you mentioned comparing to other towns that also have wells and septic, and you know, of course, the history of not many developers actually, you know, building much in town based on this inclusionary zoning. Just a question: this inclusionary zoning, there's also another zoning article that passed a few years ago, which is essentially that a developer can only build on a portion of the land, right? So let's say 40% or something like that. So my question is, do these both work at the same time?
Yes, they do. Yes, we have the open space subdivision zoning that was proposed, that was passed a couple of years ago, and that does set, you know, how the layout is preferred. It does allow a developer to offer a conventional, but we've made the open space design a by right, and the conventional, they need to get approval. So it's not out of the question. They can do a traditional. They just need to attempt to try and preserve more open space and do some clustering. But yes, you know, anything at this point, anything that is built that's more than 2 houses with the current existing inclusionary zoning kicks in, regardless of the design. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the two, it's the zoning, so all zoning applies. Marion probably can expand on that.
No, you said it correctly, except that in an open space subdivision, it still would be 6 houses that would kick in the new inclusionary zoning.
Yeah.
Not 2.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and I guess really my follow-up question to that is, any of the towns we compare to have a similar open space and inclusionary zoning? Is there any other town we can compare to in this regard?
I mean, let's see. I know Marion did more work on looking at the open space and what other towns had. I know that a lot of towns that were, especially the ones on well and septic, because of the cost, they said developers either tried to go under the number of required units, and then it wasn't proving to be an exceptionally useful tool, but it's one of those tools that we were warned back in 2016 even, that it's not always a great tool, but it's, as a town, when you're trying to find, look for any tool to help you reach the 10% in order to have some control over the progress or the look of the town's character and how those growth happens. It's a tool, but it's not a perfect tool.
Okay, thanks.
Mike, is your hand still up from before? Did you have another question? You're muted. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I just never put it down.
Okay. So what else? What other questions for Addie Mae? Comments or concerns about this?
I mean, I guess I'll just say that what we have right now is not working. Making the changes may provide some benefit. At the minimum, it might encourage someone who has a large parcel to build 3 single family homes potentially, rather than just going straight to a 40B. I don't know. It's all speculation, but or it might encourage someone to do a subdivision of, the last subdivision we had Knollcrest in the early 2000s, which was supposed to be 4 homes. It still is only 3 homes at the end of the Holliston Sherborn town line off of Washington Street. And prior to Knollcrest, the last subdivision, and this is without any of the open space subdivision requirements and without any inclusionary zoning, the last subdivision built in our town wasn't a 40B, was Cider Hill in the late 80s. So we haven't historically had a lot of subdivision development in the last 20 years. So with or without any of the other obstacles of inclusionary zoning or open space development zoning. So who knows what the right answer is, but I think the time is now to make some changes to bring it in line with the MBTA communities requirement of 10%, and to at least not penalize so greatly a developer looking to just do 1 or 2 homes.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Thank you, Addie Mae. That was super, super helpful. Really appreciate your doing that for us.
Thank you for
Good.
the time to kind of flesh it out a little bit. So
Yeah, good. We do budgets, financial stuff, but not so much the zoning. So it's really helpful to get a clear explanation of this issue, since we'll all have to kind of come to terms with it in a week and a half. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. So then let's just keep rolling on, and let's go to Article 12, which is Community Preservation Act, and Steve Tsai's gonna tell us about that.
All right, thank you. Back to my old stomping grounds here.
Welcome back. The old ground, just like before.
Yeah. All right, I've got a presentation. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, and then I know there's no time limit here, but at the hearing, it's 5 minutes to present. Is that accurate?
That sounds right. I will have to double check, but I think it's 5 minutes.
Okay. All right. Well, I've got about 10 slides, so got to do about 30 seconds per slide here. All right, here we go. All right, can you guys see this okay?
Yeah, it's good.
All right, so some quick background on the CPA. So the Community Preservation Act became a state law in 2000. Sherborn first voted on it in 2002, and we voted it down, and I do not believe that it has come up again at a town meeting. Since then, 196 communities in Massachusetts have adopted it. I think that's around 55% of all the municipalities, but about 70% of the state population live in CPA communities. Overall, a little over $3 billion has been raised through the CPA. Here's a map of the state showing in green are all the towns that have adopted CPA, and in orange we've got all of the cities, and of course Sherborn is right here. So CPA, how does it work? So essentially, there are two components to CPA. There is a local revenue component, and then there is a state matching funding component. So the local revenue comes from a surcharge that is levied onto the property tax bill. The surcharge can be anywhere between 1% and 3%, and we, being the select board, are proposing a 1% surcharge, so that's the lowest amount. Now, note that although this ultimately means that the average or everybody's tax bill is going to be higher, this does not actually increase the tax rate. And I point that out because, of course, the prime directive of the advisory committee is to manage the town's tax rate. And so this is a surcharge on the tax bill, and it is outside of the tax levy. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Now, there are three possible exemptions that are allowed with CPA, and we are proposing that we exercise all three exemptions. So you can exempt from the calculation the first $100,000 of value, both on residential real estate. So that's one exemption, and then also commercial industrial real estate. And so that's another exemption. And then you can also have an exemption where anybody that qualifies as low income or moderate income seniors basically don't have to pay the surcharge at all. So we are recommending all three exemptions. So then there's a state matching fund, which is paid for by a $50 surcharge on all real estate transactions that are submitted at the Registry of Deeds. There is also a $25 surcharge for all municipal liens. So basically, anybody who is buying a house essentially in the state has paid into the CPA trust fund. And so that's where the bulk of the money in the matching grants comes from. So this chart shows a distribution history for 20 years. I think what does this say? 2002 to 2022. And so you can see early on there was really not very many communities. And so because of that, basically all of those communities were getting a 100% match on everything on their CPA surcharge. And then over time, as the number of communities has grown, then of course the percentage of match has gone down. It went down to a minimum here in 2018. I believe this is the year that Boston, the city of Boston, adopted CPA. And so what the state has been doing as the percentage has been dropping is that the legislature has been supplementing the CPA trust with you know, year to year a different amount. Their goal, I believe, is to try to maintain about a 30% overall match. And so for the last 5 years, the average has been about a 31% match. So how would this work in Sherborn? So for fiscal 23, the average home value was 990,000 and the average tax bill was 17,842. Now, if we take on that $100,000 property exemption, then if we choose the 1% surcharge, and this Jeremy Marset did the calculations here, so thank you. Actually, I just straight up stole this slide from one of his presentations, so thank you, Jeremy. So he basically is estimating that we would be looking at about $295,000 in CPA revenue in total. So that's a combination of what the local revenue would be, as well as the distribution, which I believe he was presuming a 30 or 31%. So that's what we'd be looking at each year, is about 295,000. Now, what can we spend this money on? So there's 3 categories: open space and recreation, historic preservation, and community housing. So you can spend 10% of that money on, you have to spend 10% of that money on each of those 3 categories. And then the remaining 70% you can spend on whatever you want, as long as it is one of those 3 categories. So you could spend 80% of your money on historic preservation if that's what you wanted to do. So here are some examples of CPA projects that have been done in some other states. I kind of tried to pick some examples that look like they might scale to the types of things that Sherborn might want to do. So this is a restoration of a townhouse in Concord. I think this was a building from 1851. Here was construction of an accessible walking trail at the Mutter's Field in East Hampton. In Goshen, they built some senior housing. I admit that the first time that I ever looked at CPA, I was on the housing partnership and was basically looking for some way to try to fund affordable housing projects in town. Especially, I feel like something popular would be a Woodhaven 2, as it were. So I think that's a thing that I would want to target on the affordable housing front. And then, of course, pickleball courts, very popular these days. So these are pickleball courts in Braintree and Lenox. All right, so looking at Sherborn, so Jeremy again went through 25 years of capital in Sherborn, and basically found $6.8 million worth of projects that he thought would have been CPA eligible. And so that comes out to about $275,000 per year on average. If you remember back, our recommended surcharge and exemptions result in about a $295,000 per year of CPA funding. So it's about the rate that we spend on. If we had adopted CPA in 2002, we probably would have taken in somewhere between $2 and $3.5 million of state funds over that time that we basically have just given away or not taken. Looking at some of the projects that are currently on our capital improvement plan that might be eligible, I kind of listed these out. So the ones that are on the warrant for fiscal 25 obviously would be too early. But these are some ones that are in later fiscal years that are currently have been sort of proposed by various towns, committees in town. So these are the ones that I identified that I think would be eligible. The elder housing elevator replacement at Woodhaven, farm pond improvements, the Jameson Field renovations, and then the Sherborn History Museum, which I think you guys are all very familiar with the discussion around that. So how would this essentially, I think that the way that I would view CPA is that we could use this essentially, to me, the point is that there is a source of state money that we could be getting that we're not getting. And if we use the CPA money on the types of things that we have been spending on in capital anyways, we would be looking at, probably reducing the tax levy a little bit. On average, $295,000. If we took a 20-year bond on that at the current rate for a AAA municipal bond, the annual debt service is about $20,000. Over the course of that 20 years, you would also pay $110,000 in interest. Currently, the sort of calculation is that every $18,316 on the budget is about 1 penny on the tax rate. So this $295,000, or sort of the debt service, is about 0.011 on the tax rate, and that's about $10.96 on the average tax bill. And then over 20 years, that means that a person will have paid $219 over those 20 years for that $295,000 bond, as compared to having paid $160 for the CPA funding for essentially, that $295,000. So that's about a 37% savings. So, all right, that's it. Boy, I went 10 minutes right there.
Yeah, that was 10 minutes. It is,
I usually budget a minute per slide, and that's really what I should have done. I don't know how I can keep that in 5 slides.
and it is a 5-minute limit for the public hearing.
All right.
That aside, so questions for Steve, or comments, concerns on CPA stuff? Penn, you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I have 2 questions. One is, if this proposal is accepted at town meeting, will that lock in the 1% and lock in the 3 exemptions? And then the other question is, within those 3 categories, are there spending restrictions? For example, if we're spending at Woodhaven, can we do anything at Woodhaven with the money, or is it limited to specific things even within those limited categories?
Okay, so on the first item, you are locked in for 5 years. So once it's voted in, then those numbers, the 1% and the exemptions, are locked in for 5 years. And then after 5 years, you can change it if you want at another town meeting vote. So basically 5 years at a time. And I believe since its inception, no town that has adopted CPA has ever revoked it. I assume some of them have probably changed some of their percentages and whatnot. I don't know about that, but I do know no town has ever revoked it after they've adopted it. On the second, so this was a slide that I chose not to put in because I wouldn't have time for it, which I definitely didn't have time for. But I'm going to put this up here. So this slide is from Jeremy's presentation. So this gives you an idea of, for the different categories, what can you spend on? So for example, recreation, you can spend money on the acquisition, the creation, and the preservation of recreation facilities, but you wouldn't be able to pay for the the salary of recreation employees to support the recreation. So this is a somewhat simplified chart. This is a sort of more verbose chart. This one comes from the DOR, but it has more of the sort of explanation of what do they mean by creation, what do they mean by preservation. So there are some limitations, if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Shelley, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. For the presentation, I'm just curious, if we were to move forward with this and the funds start to be acquired, and we have certain areas where they can be spent, who who then makes the decisions on how the money is spent and like what, you know, how it's distributed among the various categories?
Yeah, good question. Again, more details that I couldn't put into the presentation with the 5-minute limit. But so along with the CPA, well, if the town were to adopt CPA, then at next year's town meeting, we would then have another article that would establish a community preservation committee. So the committee is at minimum a 5-member board, and there has to be one member who is a representative from each of these 5 committees. There is the planning board, the housing trust, the conservation commission, the historical society, and the recreation commission. So there has to be at least one member that is from each of those committees, and then you can have up to 4 additional at-large members. And essentially, it would be a bylaw that establishes the committee, and so it would define how big it was and all that kind of stuff. And so that would be something at next year's town meeting. So then that committee, you know, is basically charged with trying to figure out, you know, what types of projects they want to put forward. I believe that they are required to hold a public hearing every year to essentially get public input about what the public generally thinks that the money should be spent on. And then ultimately, this committee would decide which projects to put forth for CPA funding at a town meeting. And then it would go through, you know, each project would be its own town meeting warrant article, and it would go through all of the same stuff that every article goes through. So, you know, it would go before select board, it would go before you guys, and then it would go to town meeting for a vote.
Okay, thank you.
Wasim, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Steve. Good presentation. So why 1%? Why not 3% and build up those funds to do Woodhaven 2.0?
Basically because the higher percentage you pick, the more money each taxpayer has to pay. And given how high our tax rate and more importantly, our average tax bill is, I believe we have actually the 5th highest average tax bill in the state. And the other 4 have much higher property values than Sherborn has. So, you know, and if you look at the 5 highest tax bills and then what the tax rates are for those 5, Sherborn is by far the highest of those 5. So I think it is sort of in being sensitive to how high the tax bill is, not wanting to tack on the largest surcharge that we can. And based on Jeremy's calculations, you know, the amount of money we would be getting each year with a 1% surcharge is, you know, in keeping with our historical spending, you know, trends for CPA eligible type projects.
If I recall correctly, 1% equates to about 160?
Yes, $160.
No, 160 over 20 years or 160
No,
over
it's
20
100.
years?
It would be $160 per year. So essentially, if you had the average, you know, valued house in Sherborn, then each year your tax bill would have another $160 tacked onto it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Nora, go ahead, please.
Hi, Steve, thank you very much. I'm very much in favor of the CPA and the 1%. I think it's something we should have done a long time ago. But, you know, just there's no but actually. Just to be clear, though, if we have a $34 million budget, if that's the first numbers I saw up there, you know, divided by 1,500 households, it's about 22,000. To me, is average. It's still 1%, could even be as high as a little over $200. But I think it's still important to do. I think I'm very much in favor of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Nora. What else? Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
There we go. Sorry. Thanks, Steve. Nice presentation. Two questions for me. I guess from a pure financial stance, I think it makes sense because it allows us, in theory, on paper, to reduce our tax bill given the matching. And so, I guess the question I have is on the matching. Given the state has had to step in and supplement or fund this program, is there any concern that the states at some point in the future says we're not gonna fund this anymore and we're just gonna walk away from this and the match goes to zero?
I mean, I would say I don't imagine that it would ever go to zero because the mechanism is still in place for funding the statewide, CPA trust, right? Because at the Registry of Deeds, everyone's still paying an extra $50 into the system, But if we get to the point where somewhere close to 100% of the towns in the state have adopted it, and that it's like they could always increase the surcharge on the real estate transactions, right? I believe when CPA started, it was $20, and now it's gone up to $50. So they could always increase that, in order to get more money. It's hard to predict what the legislature would do, especially as of course it evolves over time and the state's financial status evolves over time, right? So I would say that worst case scenario, it drops down and becomes somewhere closer to the 10 to 15% match rate every year. I believe that what the state would then see is that some number of the communities would probably start revoking their CPA at that point, and again, some kind of equilibrium would be found because the more communities that pulled out of it, now there's fewer towns to spread out that money. So then each town would get a slightly higher match, and eventually you reach some kind of equilibrium. So I would imagine that worst case scenario, it still stays somewhere in that between 10 to 30% match rate for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
So I just made that up
That's helpful.
just now.
And Jeremy, no, in Jeremy's or your slide, but Jeremy's historical look back was helpful. Because I guess the other maybe concern I had, but maybe it's not as valid given this looking at the historical spending, was on paper it makes sense. You'd be able to reduce, in theory, our total tax bill. Just does it actually happen in practice, or do we actually end up spending? We feel like this money's burning a hole in our pocket. We end up spending more money than we otherwise would if we didn't have this. We do the tennis courts 5 years ago instead of next year, as an example, and pull things forward or do things that we otherwise wouldn't. That would be we actually never realize the savings. We end up spending it away. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
I would say that's an extremely valid concern. And it is probably so. 2 of the 5 select board members are not in favor of CPA, and I think it is for that exact reason, which is that they do not believe that the town will have the discipline to not just spend it on stuff that they don't need to. And furthermore, I will say that the general idea behind CPA, the spirit of it, is not to be a mechanism for towns to reduce their tax levy. It is, in fact, a mechanism to help towns build projects that they otherwise wouldn't because, their general fund, wouldn't cover it, and there are things that towns might consider luxury projects, sort of quality of life improvements, basically. And so I think the majority of towns are probably spending it on things that they would otherwise not have spent it on because they didn't have the money, right? And so essentially that's like, all right, well, here is a source of money, right? You have to put a little bit in to get some back, but you're going to get some back. And this money is restricted in use to only these types of projects, which, the CPA basically viewed as these are the types of quality of life type things that, make a town more, I don't know, vibrant, as opposed to spending it on fixing the roads or whatever, So I will say that the vast majority of towns that adopt CPA are probably ultimately spending more money out of pocket, as opposed to reducing their taxes. It's just that they are getting the benefit of the state matching funds. You know, me personally, I was on advisory for the past 6 years, and I was the chair for 3 of those years. So I know pretty well how things work in terms of the town's finances. And one of the big issues facing the town year after year is the fact that there are so few um, sort of constant, reliable revenue streams that are outside of the residential tax levy, right? I mean, there's almost nothing coming into the town. There's like a little bit of money for, Chapter 90 for the roads. There's obviously, some grants here and there. There's obviously some supplemental things in the schools for transportation, for special education, but it's like realistically, I think it's like 91% or something of the budget is essentially paid for by residential taxes, right? And we have very minimal commercial industrial. So it's the people living here, the private citizens, and the taxes on their homes. That's what's paying for everything. So to me, I'm like, this is a source of revenue that is outside of the tax levy. And we have so few of those things that it's like it seems irresponsible of the town to not take advantage of any of these. I mean, this is only really a trickle of money compared to the entire budget, but it's not zero, And so to me, that's where it makes sense, is that we could be getting, it's $100,000 of money from the state every year, and we're just saying, no, let's just not do that. And furthermore, because all of the residents of the town are paying into the CPA trust system, right? It's not like if we opt out that it's just kind of like it's not a net zero, right? We're all paying into it, but we're not getting anything back. So all the residents in town are helping to subsidize all of the other towns that have adopted CPA. And meanwhile, we're not getting any of that. So, to me, I'm like, there's got to be a sort of conservative, balanced way to take advantage of that revenue stream and not, significantly increase our tax bill. And so that's why I have proposed it the way I have. I think that the Community Preservation Coalition, which is an advocacy group that's trying to get towns to adopt CPA, I don't think that they would agree with my particular sales pitch on CPA, which is more of the fiscally conservative. This is a smart thing to do for the financial health of the town. That's not really the point of CPA. But if you look at some of the projects that are being done, it's like, well, these are the types of projects that we would like to see in, I mean, the pickleball courts. It's just, I mean, it's an obvious current example, right? Like we are considering paying for that ourselves, right? And in fact, you guys today were just talking about like, yes, I think we should probably pay for the tennis courts and the pickleball courts for $500,000. That's easily the type of thing that this town might decide that's too rich for our blood, right? And CPA is the type of thing that would then cover that, right? So to me, I'm like, well, the things that we're looking at, they're the same types of quality of life enhancements that other towns are getting from CPA. And it's just that when we want to do those things, we have to just pay for it fully out of pocket, as opposed to getting a little bit of a subsidy from the state.
Thanks, Steve.
What else? Anybody else?
I am trying to raise my hand, but I think you may have it set so that I can't.
Okay, sorry about
Maybe
that. Go ahead, Marion.
Maybe I'll just talk.
Go ahead.
I thought Steve really made a very good case. I've been in favor of CPA for a long time, voted for it twice in town. Actually, it was voted down twice, Steve. And both times it was because people were so afraid of any surcharge on their taxes. But I think it's good to recall that the town it's very difficult given the fact that all our taxes come from residential, all our revenues come from residential taxes. It's very difficult to sell extra things that are quality of life improvements. And to do anything like that, as we see every year, the town as a whole has to tighten its belt in other ways. And yet, 160 average dollars on the average tax bill, surely people in town can tighten their belt and maybe go out to dinner one less time or two less times a year. So to me, it's a matter of who's tightening their belt. I mean, who is behind improving the quality of life? And this sort of puts improvement of the quality of life into the law in a way that people will get used to without a lot of impact.
Thanks, Marion. Anybody else? So Steve, that was great. I support this as well. It seems to me, for all the reasons you said, like a very sensible thing for the town to do. I think it will be interesting to see how it plays at town meeting, but certainly seems to me like a very sensible thing for the town to go ahead and approve. Unless anybody else has anything else for Steve. So thanks, Steve, and we'll get to hear a version of this again in a week and a half at the public hearing.
Yeah, I'll have to find a way to shorten it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
And if this little taste of advisory, if you're missing it, I'm sure there's always a path back. I just kidding.
Oh no, earlier when I was listening to you guys talk about the previous things, I was rolling on the floor. I was rolling on the floor, like writhing, and so yeah.
Yeah.
6 years was enough.
Yeah. Okay. Wasim, did you have something more on this for Steve or another?
Yeah. From a process perspective, I mean, I thought Steve's presentation is excellent. If he cannot finish the presentation in 5 minutes, there is a way for someone to essentially ask him to continue, right? During town meeting. So let's say, you shorten your presentation, because I really think, the content there is important. And if you actually don't go through your presentation, you're just going to end up with more Q&As. That's really going to prolong the town meeting more than really with the intent of the 5-minute time limit. So there is actually, please correct me, I don't know, Steve, Dan, there is a mechanism that if he does not finish, someone can actually step up from us, step up and ask for a continuation or something like that.
I mean, I think maybe the one easy way to manage that is, we've all seen Steve's 10-minute version. He's going to have to trim some things out. We can certainly ask questions that he could then say, oh, well, I've got a couple slides that exactly answer that, and then come back to it. That would be one easy way to manage that, I think.
Yeah, that's most likely what I'll do is I'll move some of these more information dense slides to after the last slide, and then if people have questions, I can just skip to those. So yeah, it'll be fine. I'll keep it to 5 minutes, because honestly, I'm not worried about the public hearing, because I think, Dan, you'll give me a couple minutes if I need it. It's more at the town meeting itself. I don't want to be.
You'll be locked at 5 minutes.
Yeah. I don't think Mary Wolf is going to let me go.
Yeah. There's flexibility at the public hearing that there isn't at town meeting. Either the way that Wasim mentioned or the way I mentioned, with people asking questions that would prompt you to provide some information.
Yeah, I mean, some of the questions that you guys asked, I knew somebody was going to ask them, so I was prepared to answer them, including I knew exactly which slide I needed to put up when the question was asked about, well, what can you actually spend it on? Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, so our last set of things, I think Deb Seifring is going to take us through. And Deb, I have the spreadsheet that you put together on free cash stabilization. I'm guessing that would be the one to share.
Yeah, that's a good starting point.
Great. And I think if you could just walk us through that, I think, give me just 1 second to get that set. I think that will pretty much cover it. If you have other things that we got to talk about, that's great too. Okay. Deb, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So like when we talk about the supplementals and the money going to the stabilization accounts, we really start with our free cash number. And so for after fiscal year 24, our free cash number was the $2.78 million. So that's our starting point. And we have a policy that we like to keep 3 to 5% of a balance of free cash so that the following year we're in good shape. So based on that, we start looking at what we can set aside to still come up with that balance. So one of the first things we're going to look at is like the stabilization accounts. And for general stabilization, we like to have a balance of 3% of our operating budget. And so to achieve that, we need to put in $100,000. The OPEB liability trust fund, historically, we put in $100,000 from free cash and $100,000 from the operating fund. So we put that in there. And then the capital stabilization is a relatively new account. So that's fluctuated depending on how much free cash we have. And last year, and then again this year, we're proposing to put in the balance of what we don't need for snow and ice, because snow and ice is still fluctuating. When I put the slide together, it was, we were over by $37,000 in the snow and ice account. But we just processed bills today, and there was another bill in there for $4,000 for some repair of snow equipment. And there could be another snowstorm and things like that. So between the two accounts, we're setting aside $200,000. And, if we had to make the decision today, we would put $38,000 for the snow and ice supplemental and then move the balance into the capital stabilization account. And then the other thing we need a supplemental for FY24 is that we need to supplement the ambulance. It's a revolving fund and it's currently running at a negative balance. So talking to Jeremy and the fire chief, we think we need about $60,000 at the end of the year to make that a zero balance. And then the other things that we'd be using free cash for are the capital items that you've already discussed, the substantial equipment that you've already discussed, and the opioids going to the special revenue funds. So with all those uses of free cash, it's like $816,000, which leaves us a balance of the 1,000,009, which at this point is 5.74%. So those are our proposed uses of free cash at this point in time. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, that was very clear. That was terrific. So questions, comments, concerns about the proposal here? I have a hunch that I did not send this spreadsheet around to everybody, so I will do that. Should have done that, sorry.
Deb, this is certified free cash from last year.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is for the new folks on advisory, that is the town submits, its financials, and the state then kind of checks and verifies them and then comes back to the town with, here's the certified amount of free cash, which is then available for the town to do things like this with. Kind of like a little bit like retained earnings in a private.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
So forgive me again, for the fiscal year 23 supplementals?
It should actually be fiscal year 24.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's for this fiscal year. It's the snow and ice and the ambulance, which we've been doing historically, those two supplements.
Okay. So I didn't just catch. You said, are you putting 100,000, or are you actually putting? You're waiting to see, and potentially you may end up just putting 38,000. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
then we would take the balance, let's say it's 40,000, we would take the additional 60,000 and move it into the capital stabilization account. So we would just, we would still be using that free cash, but we would be using it for capital stabilization rather than the snow and ice supplemental.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
And on the ambulance supplemental, I believe it's the case, recall that when the fire chief talked about the ambulance budget, he talked about kind of updating the accounting so the accounting would better reflect the actuals, because the amount of revenue, the fees coming into the revolving fund have for a number of years been lower than what had been estimated, and hence every year there's a supplemental because it's not enough. And I think he has adjusted that, so now, at least in expectation, the operating budget would cover the part, there's a more reasonable estimate of the fees coming in, the operating budget would cover the balance. And so never know how the world's going to work out, but at least an expectation going forward, presumably we would not be needing to do this supplemental every year, because we've kind of fixed the estimates of revenue to be more realistic and folded that into the budget, rather than having an unrealistic revenue fee estimate and then needing to do a supplemental to top it up every year. So hopefully going forward, this either won't be a thing, or it will be much smaller.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dan. So like for fiscal year 24, the budget for the ambulance was $232,500. And next year, the proposed budget is $290,000, which is more or less the $60,000 supplement.
Yeah. And it's just doing more. I mean, it's all getting paid for one way or another by the town, but it's just being a little more realistic about the budgeting.
That's correct.
Penn, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a little bit of color to that. If I understood correctly and remembered correctly, two big question marks. I was speaking with Chief Ward about this, and he said part of what skewed their ability to account for this has been the increasing percentage of ambulance calls that are paid for by Medicare, which pays much less than regular insurance does, and a good bit less than the cost. So that's been it's created the target's been moving in a way that was not predictable.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Except they're all getting older, but that's another story.
Anybody else? All right, I will send the spreadsheet around so everyone has a chance to, have a closer look as desired. And again, the allocation of free cash, these things it's pretty standard and comparable to what's been done in recent years. There's nothing here that, at least from my vantage point, nothing here that would be a big surprise or a big change from how this has been handled in recent years.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Deb.
Yep.
That's great. Oh, Paul, did you have a thing on this?
Yeah, I had a question about the reserve fund. I wonder if you can bring up that sheet.
Yeah, I was going to get to that in just a second.
Sure,
So that was our next. I was going to get to that. It's a different spreadsheet. I was going to get that in just a second.
Good.
Okay. So let's do that. We'll get this off and give me 1 second here. And another spreadsheet to share. Okay, so Paul had raised, the question about the 300,000 that goes to the reserve that comes from the operating budget is allocated to go into the reserve fund every year, right? Which is the fund that's used for covering unexpected things, or at the end of the year, if a department ran over budget, if a culvert collapses, it's the place where it is possible to quickly get funds without needing to return to town meeting. And this is actually the one place where advisory actually has statutory authority rather than just offering opinions, because the advisory committee actually has to approve any spending from the reserve fund. So it's our one grand bit of actual authority rather than just offering our opinions to the world and to town meeting. So what the table here shows, actually, Deb, I should let you walk us through this because I think you put this together. You'll do a better job than I would.
Yeah, sure. The request was to see what the history was. So I just went back from, for several years, and you can see back in FY, I think it was 19, we just started putting a flat $300,000 there. I'm not sure the years prior to that why it fluctuated like it did, or if there was any method to it. But it's been $300,000. It's been flat. And, that's really less than 1% of our budget. If you think about, our budget is $34 million. So we're kind of putting a buffer in there for $300,000. And as Dan said, if we ever spend any money out of it, it has to first go to advisory for their approval and then to the select board for final approval before we can transfer it into any of the other funds. Starting like in FY20, there was, during the course of the year, there were, like 3 different items that they transferred the money for. One was, the planning board was running over budget, so we moved it for that. There was some DPW, something happened in DPW, so we moved 110,000. But then in FY21, there was no need to do any reserve fund transfers during the course of the year. So we really just used that money at the end of the year to move money from the reserve fund transfer to any of the departments that were in a deficit at the end of the year. And so that was kind of a nice, clean accounting way to do it. So let's say in FY20, if there were a deficit in different departments, they would move money, let's say from the select board office, which was over, to DPW, which was less. And there was a lot of transferring back and forth. So just to make it a little bit cleaner in FY21, if we have money left in the reserve fund, we use that money to cover any departmental deficits at the end of the fiscal year. So that's FY22. You can see that we used $219,000 for deficits. We had to do a reserve fund transfer during the course of the year when our town administrator left. Last year, I don't know if anybody was on there, you remember, like the electricity costs were high, we're running over budget. That we did the highway needed some money. We were short on insurance because the library was over. So we did some reserve fund transfers during the course of the year, and then again did the year-end transfers for $177,000. So that's really the purpose of the reserve fund, in case anything goes way over budget during the course of the year, and then use the balance to cover year-end deficits.
And I would just add to Deb's really nice explanation that, if there's funds, excess funds in a department because they spend less than budgeted, or if for some reason, this wasn't all used up, it just rolls over to free cash for the next year. The money doesn't disappear, but whatever, either from a department budget that's unspent or reserve fund that's unutilized, just rolls over into free cash and then is available following.
That's correct.
So Paul, why don't you start off since you were the one who had raised the question.
On that total line of row 35, I don't see that as the total spent out of this because you're including the year-end transfer. I would not include that because that's just excess stuff from the reserve. For example, in fiscal year 22, it seems like we spent $81,000 from that fund, right? So like, to me, like row 35, I don't think it's fair to include the year-end transfer as part of that total.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's, on the presentation, we used $81,000 during the course of the year, but by the end of the year, we did use $219,000 out of this account to pay for everything else.
Right.
So if you look at fiscal year 23, you can see that we didn't use the whole $300,000. there was, you know, a balance of $3,530 left even after the reserve fund transfers.
Right,
So, yeah.
Yeah, because if I take out all those reserve fund transfers over the past 5 years, we've always spent less than $150,000. So that's kind of what I'm getting. I think there's $300,000 that we put into this every year, but we only use a fraction of that. It seems to me that we might be putting more money than needed in there, because the rest I know gets rolled over, it stays with the town. But to me, it's not fair to to me, like the amount spent is what we should be looking at, not including the year-end transfer.
Just so I've got some reactions to that, but Jeremy, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So, I mean, I just from my observations on it, so the reserve fund is a requirement that we have. The Department of Local Services, it requires municipalities to have a reserve fund. They don't have a specific percentage of the operating budget that they set as a minimum. They advise towns to tailor the amount to their specific situation. But generally, they would frown upon reducing the amount that was set aside for reserve fund, the reserve fund, or actually they don't even allow you to reduce the amount set aside for snow and ice, for instance. It's very similar, where they would like to see it stay even or be increasing as a percentage of your budget as it increases, or remaining the same percentage as your budget as your budget increases. And it's a good thing that the town has not had the need to spend funds from the reserve fund. That's great, but it's there as an insurance policy, so that the town can continue to pay its bills and not have to hold a special town meeting to do some reappropriations or fall short. So that's a good thing, and like mentioned, that there's certainly the oversight the advisory has on it. And I think I'd also just caution you folks, by way of this coming August, we'll be doing a borrowing, and we'll need, they'll be looking at our credit rating as a result of that borrowing. And the rating agencies will look at things like this and see if the town is steadily funded these sorts of accounts, and may not look favorable should we reduce it by an amount. So just some observations.
Right. If I may, Dan, right?
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll offer some thoughts as well.
So I don't disagree on the need for it, but I'm flagging, I guess. I think we're putting more insurance in here than needed. If we had this at say $150,000, we would have covered everything for all the years on this sheet. So I'm thinking, like, maybe if we said something like $200,000 instead of $300,000, that would be $100,000 less that we're collecting from taxpayers. That's the way I looked at it, right?
Yeah, so I think I come down on the side of thinking that, this is a useful insurance policy, because something unexpected does happen. If, the town would need to have a special town meeting to get an appropriation, that is a complicated, time-consuming, messy thing, and you burn up a lot of people's time doing that. And on the numbers, I mean, Paul, you're absolutely right that, that the year-end transfers, in principle, that's covering departments whose budgets went over for one reason. In principle, those could be covered by departments that went under, but you don't see that here. So if there weren't, say, in fiscal 23, if you don't count the 177, and so you just do the 50 plus 52 plus 16, and you get to whatever that is, about 120. Well, okay, if there wasn't 177,000 in other departments that were under budget, then we wouldn't have the 177,000 to transfer from the departments that were under budget to the departments that were over budget. And so then we could end up in a situation, maybe there would be the 177,000 of under budget departments, but not necessarily. And then we could end up in a situation where, say a 200,000 or 150,000 reserve fund might not be enough to cover both the, the overages and, taking care of the year-end transfers for departments that went over. So, I mean, I take your point, but, I mean, the piece that isn't here is, well, what each year was the under budget piece that, potentially could have funded the year-end transfer line. But I don't think it's quite right to just say that year-end transfer line is money that didn't need to be spent, because it was, there were departments that ran over, and that has to be funded somehow, either from other departments that ran under, if there are enough of those, or from this fund. And I think I would also emphasize Jeremy's point, that with S&P ratings call this summer, the town has managed to sustain a AAA rating. And I mean, there are many factors that go into that. And I think the hope would be that the town can manage that again. But I guess I think I would share the concern that Jerry mentioned of, if this dropped back, it'd probably be one of many factors, but one that I suspect rating agencies would look at and would think, that's an odd thing that you did. Why'd you do that? You're a little less well protected against adverse events. So.
Right. Okay. Thanks. I think that kind of addresses my question. I think we should be looking at this longer term, because I feel like maybe we are putting more money in than needed. So it's more the dollar amount, but maybe we give it a few more years to see, because I agree it's not worth risking the ratings.
And it would be interesting to, which, are the numbers that aren't here, is, what was the sum of funds available from the departments that were under budget, and, how did that balance with the year-end transfer number? And that would be another piece to be interesting to look at. But anyway, so so it's really interesting when you raised the question. And when you raised the question, Deb put this together, and then I, spent some time thinking about it, because I had the same thought you did of, well, if can get the tax levy down by $100,000, that's a good thing. But as I dug into it more, I ended up with the concerns that I mentioned. What
There's
else?
There's a lot bigger reserve fund in town that we could address, but I'll leave that for another day.
Oh, yeah. Took me a minute to catch up with you. Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah, it's a little more money than this one. What else? Okay, so our next get together is the public hearing, and it occurred to me that there's one extra thing that might be helpful for me to just say by way of background and how that process works, since I know there's some, differences of opinion on the Board of Health position and the rec position. So when we get to the operating budget, I will read for each department the budget line, and really what advisory is gonna either approve or hold and pull out and then consider separately would be those budget lines. So if, for instance, the Board of, one of us decided to call a hold on the Board of Health budget line and wanted that pulled out, then, we'd vote on all the other elements in the operating budget and, do that. And then we'd come to the Board of Health. But it's not really a point where we can then kind of make policy changes. What we could do is say, if I'm making up numbers because I don't have the Board of Health budget in front of me, if that number was $248,000, we could say we want to recommend $243,000, and in our write-up we could say, because we think that this position should be funded in a different way. But we don't actually, I think, have the scope in that meeting to say, here is the way that the Board of Health should structure its employees. The thing we can vote on and have leverage on or make a recommendation on is the budget for each department. So I think that I don't think I made that particularly clear at the beginning, but I wanted to just put that out there, because we can offer an opinion in our write-up on anything, but in terms of the operating budget and the lines, I don't think we can really, you know, write in words and language, here is the way that the Board of Health should organize its staff. That just isn't something that we actually, I think, can do, other than putting words into our report that, you know, say we're recommending a change in the budget with, you know, the intention or the hope that, you know, the Board of Health would proceed in a particular way. So I just as kind of set up for, you know, a week from Saturday. Okay, everybody appropriately exhausted? Okay. Unless anybody has anything else, I think we are set.
I just wanted to thank Wasim for taking minutes for me. Thank you, Wasim.
Yeah,
You can
thanks.
switch.
That was good. That was helpful. And Paul, hope you're doing something fun and can enjoy some of the good weather there.
Right.
Paul, you were joking, right?
That
Sorry, maybe we had a little bit of a miscommunication then. I actually stopped taking minutes. I thought you took it over. But
I actually did take some minutes. I can probably put it together if you send me what you started.
yeah, I did send you. Yeah, I did send you
Okay,
the file, but I stopped
Okay.
way early on. Maybe. Okay. Apologies if
okay.
we miscommunicated
No
there.
worries. No worries. I can
Okay.
get the video now. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the video, it'll take 2 days or something to get the video posted, and it'll be there. Okay. Unless anybody has anything else, I would welcome a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thanks. All right, quick roll call. Mike Winters,
Aye.
Paul,
Aye.
Natalie,
Aye.
Nora,
Like,
Mike Flanagan,
I
Shelley,
Hi.
Penn,
Aye.
Wasim,
Aye.
and I am I as well. So 9-0 to adjourn. All right. Thank you, everybody, for slogging through this. Covered a lot of material. There'll be a pile of stuff I'll send out before we get to the public hearing. And hopefully that'll be a good day. So thanks, everybody. See you in a week and a half.